Welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming out today for our webinar, New Takes on the Past, Contemporary Perspectives on Medieval Judaism. Feel free to drop your location in the chat as we all set sail here. My name is David Kaufman. I'm the acting director of the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies at York University in Toronto. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you all. Welcome to Professor Elisheva Karlbach and Professor Eve Krakowski. It's wonderful to have you join us from Columbia and Princeton, respectively. An extra warm welcome to and familiar welcome to Professor Marty Lakshin, our longtime faculty colleague, former center director, mentor, and friend. Marty, it's always a pleasure to have you back for center events and really learning in the Jewish Greater Toronto area with you. Again, we've missed you since you moved to Jerusalem, so thank you for helping us lead today's session and for leaping time zones to be with us. And it's particularly sweet pleasure for me to offer the first public welcome, the first public program welcome to our newest colleague, Professor Mark Herman, who joined our faculty here at York this past summer. We're thrilled that we managed to scoop you off the job market and are really looking forward to working with and learning from you in the years ahead. To our webinar audience, if you'd like more information about our amazing and vibrant Center for Jewish Studies and want to be a part of it or support it in any way, feel free to visit our website, which I'll drop in the chat in a moment after I'm done my introductions, or join our mailing list. You can follow us on social media, or you can just email me. You can find my email on the center website as well. So I've asked Professor Lakshin to be our facilitator for today's discussion. He is University Professor Emeritus of Humanities and Hebrew here at York. He taught full-time at York for 38 years and served over these many years in many leadership roles, including as chair of the Department of Humanities and as the director of our Center for Jewish Studies, as I mentioned. His publications include a 4-volume annotated translation into English of the Torah commentary of the 12th century Northern French rabbi Rashbam, and a 2-volume annotated Hebrew edition of the same commentary. He retired and moved to Jerusalem 7 years ago now. He continues to do research and academic writing, still teaches the occasional online course for us in Jewish Studies at York, and teaches in person at the MA program in Bible at the Givat Washington Academic College of Education near Ashdod in Israel. Professor Lakshin will do some introductions and steer us through the conversation, which will eventually open up to everyone using the Q&A function today. So I'll keep an eye on that Q&A function. If you have questions that you want panelists to address over the course, please pop them in the Q&A. And I'm very much looking forward to our discussion. Over to you, Marty.
Thank you very much, David. It's a great pleasure, so to speak, to be back at York University after 38 years of working there, 38 wonderful years of working there full time, and with the great benefit here of Zoom. That's unnecessary for me to even get on a plane to come back to a York University event. We've gathered together, as David said, a wonderful panel here, and I'm looking forward to a really interesting discussion about what is going on in our field, what has gone on in our field, and what will be going on in our field. I'll introduce the 3 panelists right now, and then we'll proceed to the questions. Professor Elisheva Karlbach teaches Jewish history at Columbia University, where she holds the very prestigious position of being the Salo Baron Professor of Jewish History, Culture, and Society, and the co-director of the Institute for Israel and Jewish Studies. She's the author of a number of award-winning books: The Pursuit of History, which won a National Jewish Book Award; Divided Souls, Jewish Converts to Christianity or Early Modern German Lands; Palaces of Time, Jewish Calendar and Culture in Early Modern Europe, which won the Association for Jewish Studies Schenitzer Book Prize; and Confronting Modernity from 1750 to 1880, Volume 6 in the Posen Library of Jewish Culture and Civilization. She has held fellowships at the New York Public Library Center for Scholars and Writers, the Katz Center at the University of Pennsylvania, and the Tikva Center at NYU Law School. She has served as editor of the AJS Review and as president of the American Academy for Jewish Research. In 2017, she was awarded the Lengfest Distinguished Faculty Award of Columbia University. Her teaching and research interests include Jewish-Christian relations, Messianism, Jewish communities, and Jewish women's history in early modern Europe. Our second panelist is Professor Eve Perkowski, who's an associate professor of Near Eastern Studies and Judaic Studies at Princeton University. She studies the social history of the medieval Middle East, mainly through the surprising treasure trove of everyday documents preserved in the Cairo Geniza. Her work to date has focused mainly on gender, kinship, and rabbinic law among Jews in Egypt. Her first book, Coming of Age in Medieval Egypt, Women's Adolescence, Jewish Law and Ordinary Culture, was published in 2018. She is now working on a second book tentatively titled When Judaism Became Rabbinic, which examines how and why new forms of Jewish writing developed and spread widely across the Islamic Mediterranean during the 9th and 10th centuries. And as David said before, perhaps our guest of honor here is the new hire at York University, Professor Mark Herman, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Humanities at York. His research focuses on the interactions of Jewish and Islamic intellectual history in the medieval Mediterranean, with a particular interest in the overlapping sacred histories of Jews and Muslims. He's a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania. He's held postdoctoral fellowships at Columbia University, Fordham University, Harvard University, the University of Michigan, and the University of Pennsylvania, and the Yale Law School. He is the co-editor of a book entitled Accounting for the Commandments in Medieval Judaism, Studies in Law, Philosophy, Pietism, and Kabbalah, and he's currently writing a monograph titled After Revelation, the Rabbinic Past in the Islamic World. Professor Herman is part of a small but growing group of scholars who have an unusual combination of skills, of an ability to deal in depth with classical rabbinic texts, and also to deal with Judeo-Arabic texts and with Arabic texts, and thus he is able to talk about the intellectual relationships between Jews and Muslims in an impressive kind of way. We have, as I said before, three very respected professors on the panel list. Because we are colleagues, we are going to refer to each other by our first names, and I checked with them beforehand that no one has any problem with that. The members of our panel all look back with a scholar's eye on the distant past. Today, we're going to ask them to look back on more recent history, on the history of their own field. And maybe I'll just kick off the discussion myself with my memories for almost 50 years ago when I decided to go into this field. One of the big changes that was occurring in academia back then was the move towards interdisciplinarity, into the belief that one need not confine one's research to one specific discipline, history, philosophy, literature, but that combining these tools of study yields good results. I had the good fortune to go to Brandeis University, where in graduate school, they forced me to take courses in Jewish history, in Jewish philosophy, in modern Hebrew literature, in languages. I remember when I was pursuing my studies, talking with an older faculty member from another university who expressed disdain at the course of studies that I was taking, and saying that it sounded to him like a dilettante kind of education instead of going into depth in just one field. But this was a change that was occurring back then in the 1970s with an understanding that interdisciplinarity was a reasonable way of pursuing academic knowledge. This led to the creation of many area studies programs like African American studies, European studies, and it made room for universities to have a program such as a Jewish studies program. So that's my recollection of the time when I entered this field. Now I'll turn to the panelists and ask them, when you trained to do scholarly work in medieval Jewish studies or in other pre-modern periods of Jewish studies, what were seen as the big issues in the field? What were the bigger intellectual currents in academia in those years? And did these issues and currents have an effect on your own training and on your own interests? Maybe we'll begin with you, Eve, if that's okay. You've got the floor, please.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much. Okay, so I'm going to focus, I guess, on the trends that had the biggest impact on me. So what I'm about to say isn't comprehensive. But for me, the biggest change is this. I started graduate school. I finished graduate school in 2012. I may not want to say when I started. It took me a long time to finish. But I started graduate school in the wake of a really large scale change in the study of history in general that occurred in the second half of the 20th century, especially in the 60s and 70s. But then it sort of trickled down into other fields such as medieval Jewish history in the decades following that. And this is a shift from telling history as a kind of story of great men, so primarily political history of kings, the states that they ran, the wars that they fought, alongside, the handful of enduring thinkers whose written works we still have, towards a more bottom-up history that looks at how, or tries to look at how past societies worked in all of their complexity, examining people at all levels of society, so not just great men, but women and children and farmers and paupers and slaves, how they lived, how they thought about the world. This isn't, of course, always possible to do, and we don't always know if we're getting things right, but this is what became the goal of many historians to a much greater degree in the second half of the 20th century. You can think of it as, instead of telling history as a narrative story of kind of the major things that happened, more of an anthropology of the past. This was spearheaded by, most kind of famously by this group of scholars in France called the Annales School. It had a huge effect on historians in pretty much all fields in the later 20th century. And it was catching up, I would say, full force in medieval Jewish history by the 90s. So how does this translate into medieval Jewish history? So much of what historians in our field had focused on, which is really natural given the sources that we have to work with, was kind of a Jewish minority religious group version of this kind of big scale political and intellectual history. So we had kind of attempts to reconstruct who were the great Jewish leaders of each generation and each time and place. Obviously, tremendous amount of work on the highly literate thinkers who have given us the writings that continue to be our main source base. And these topics kind of stood in for the Jews as a group. So you had a, history of Jewish law, thought, and philosophy, almost like a kind of, historian's version of Pirkei Avot in some ways, Moses to Joshua, to the elders, to the prophets, to the rabbis, to Rashi and Maimonides, so to speak. And beyond that, a kind of minority version of the kings and states and wars type of history. So, the major Jews who were power players at court, and then in general, how Jews as a group, what their standing and status was in medieval societies. So by the time, this was already changing long before I started graduate school. And by the time I finished graduate school in 2012, the changes had really kind of exploded in full force. So people are still interested in all of the topics I just mentioned, but the way that they think about them has just changed a lot. And I would say the biggest change is just that the focus is much more granular, much more looking, instead of a single narrative about the Jews of the Middle Ages or of medieval Europe or, the medieval Near East as a monolith. Scholars are thinking much more in terms of attention to populations of medieval Jews as human beings living in complicated human societies. And instead of taking Jewishness as a category for granted, people were trying to understand much more what it meant to be Jewish in a given time and place. I was going to talk about some important works that came out during the time I was in grad school that really impacted me, but I think I've already gone over time. So maybe I'll save that for later in the roundtable.
Thank you very much, I think that you described very well many of the changes that we all experienced. I remember that in the beginning of my career, when a student came to me and told me that she wanted to write about Jewish widows in the Middle Ages, I said, we're not going to find any material about that. And she and I went and we found, and it was an eye-opening experience for me too. Mark, can I give you the floor?
Sure. Thank you, Marty, for hosting and for the kind words that were clearly filled into my bio that weren't actually there. But I think I'm only trained a little bit after Eve did, so a lot of my feelings were very similar. But I think I came from both from my own interests and the people I'd worked with were more interested in the sort of the older intellectual issues, the questions of rabbinic culture, and how they were understood. But at the same time, I think that, as Eve hinted at, that subfield within the subfield of medieval Jewish history really tried to, or at its best, tries to learn lessons from this realization of just how integrated Jews were. So I think when I started graduate school, I was at the tail end, perhaps, of a longer debate looking at various medieval Jewish subcommunities that asked, are they part of the world around them? Are they not? It was sort of a binary assumption and sort of question, yes or no. And I think the field realized fairly quickly that the answer is not yes or no, but in what ways and how are Jews integrated and how should we understand Jews as part of the larger society? I took many classes with Elisheva, who I am curious to hear from as well. And I hope I don't butcher the lesson that she taught me, but one of the main mantras that I remember from her classes was that, the way we have to understand Jews in their setting was not that they are part of a host society, that there's a host Christian society to which Jews are added in, but Jews are part and parcel of this world. And I'm sure Elisheva will say this better than I have and that I can, but that we need to understand Jews were there from the beginning and they were part and parcel of the society that we're studying. So we want to understand medieval Europe, early modern Egypt, whatever the case may be, Jews were always part of the landscape, and their Judaism, their cultural expressions, in whatever way those came about, were embedded in that society from the very beginning. So we can't understand Jews, as one society and Christians as another, but we need to read them together as much as possible if we want to understand the world that both of these groups, members of both groups, were really participating in.
Thank you, Mark. Elisheva, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much. And again, congratulations to York University on this very auspicious occasion of welcoming Mark Herman to your faculty and among your ranks. Mark is a student who takes what he gets and makes a great deal more out of it than we were able to give him. So I just can't wait to see his book. So when I was an undergraduate student, I came away with a feeling that the medieval period in general was a kind of static foil to everything that came after. I entered the early modern period thinking, okay, now here's the point where things open up. And what has happened, and this was particularly true for medieval Ashkenaz. I remember as a student thinking about how insular it was, how, there's Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam, and maybe a handful of other influential figures, but it was really generative within its own very circumscribed ambit. So it was text-based, yes, the big man story-based. Almost everything has changed since then, and the younger generation of medievalists, I think, are to be credited for such change. I, too, remember being told that one cannot do women's history before the 19th century because, and I quote, there are no sources. It might be a worthy subject to study, but there are no sources. Needless to say, Those present, Eve in particular, I want to single out Elisheva Baumgarten's work, have proven that that is simply not the case. I remember when my own professor, David Berger, argued that the Nitzachon Yashan was a handbook for ordinary Jews encountering live dialogue between neighbors as opposed to learned exchanges between rabbis and clergymen. This was a revolutionary idea that you can actually say something about ordinary Jews. This was new. Today, so many new disciplines and sub-disciplines, Kabbalah, magic, material history, gender and gender orientation history, the transfer of ideas between Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews, between Jews and the larger cultures, as has already been mentioned, an understanding on how people lived, even a better understanding on what the fine-grained transmission of documents and ideas, something that Mark has worked on, and I hope he'll say more about, as well as Eve, actually, on different bodies, or maybe the same body of texts. So the idea of pursuing the life of the non-elite, that this too was dynamic, interesting, important, I think that's the biggest change.
Marty, you have to unmute. Start your turn again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Elisheva. There are many points that you made there that I was thinking of reacting to, but the first one of the kind of belief that in medieval, that you have to get past the medieval times in order to get to a period that would be of any interest to us in our lives today. I'll just tell a story that a course that I was teaching at York, where there was a rabbi from the Jewish community who was a very wise person, but didn't have very much academic background. And I taught a text from Ibn Ezra, and he came up to me after class and he said, I wish that one could express oneself so openly in the 20th century as Ibn Ezra expressed himself back in the 12th. This eye-opening experience for me through the eyes of this rabbi who realized that there was a lot of really interesting stuff, daring stuff going on back in medieval times. The second question that for our panelists was touched on a little bit already, but we'll give you more of a chance to expand on what you said. The question is primarily, what are you studying today when you study medieval Judaism or early modern Judaism? Are you studying the history of ideas? Are you studying the history of the community? Are you studying the contact between Jews and non-Jews? And maybe I'll just tell one last story before I give the floor back to the panelists. Again, when I was a graduate student a very long time ago, there was a story that went around in graduate student circles, not from Brandeis, the university that I was at, but from another university that I won't mention, of a student who went to the head of the department and said, I'd like to write a doctoral dissertation about the social history of the Jews of Poland. And the head of the program allegedly said to him, they own taverns. What else do you want to know? That kind of dismissive attitude. But the change was going on already in the 1970s. This older faculty member was not affected by this change. So to change the order a little bit of who's answering, could I ask you, Mark, what are you studying today when you study medieval Judaism?
I wish I was studying taverns and drinking habits. It'd probably be more fun than what I actually do study. But Marty mentioned very briefly the current project that I'm working on at the moment is a sort of history of how Jews imagine Judaism. And in some senses, it's sort of an older question. How did the intellectual history, I'm focusing on people who, many of whom we already know, Saadia Gaon, Maimonides, figures like that, and I'm sort of asking a question that's maybe been asked before in terms of what did they think of God? What did they think of the world around them? But I think, so when I'm studying their world constructions, let's say, what I'm trying to do, which I think is different perhaps than has been done in the past, is really to understand those ideas as not just as an internal Jewish question. So the question that I'm asking is not only, how did Maimonides make sense of earlier Jewish sources when he's promulgating his Judaism, or how did Saadia read a certain passage in the Babylonian Talmud and make sense of it when he's trying to make a claim about revelation? But what I'm really trying to understand is, how did these systems make sense in their worlds, right? What was going on in the larger society, in the larger Mediterranean, that allowed the Jews to make the arguments that they did, right? Unlike some of my colleagues who work in medieval Ashkenaz, I have the benefit of studying people who wrote in a language that was used by their larger society. Their intellectual production was in Arabic or Judeo-Arabic, but they could read and understand the ideas that were circulating around them. We know without question, right? They access this vehicle of the linguistic vehicle provided them with access to philosophy, to science, to all sorts of fields that would have been cutting edge in their day. So the question that I'm asking about these big world constructions, and I hope try to ask, is how they were produced by the world in which they lived. What can they tell us about the interactions and the constructions of Judaism, and how did they overlap with constructions of nearby Islam? And it's, lo and behold, isn't so surprising that a lot of the similar ways that Jews constructed Judaism, the ways that Jews constructed Judaism were very similar to the way that Muslims constructed Islam. So they imagined God in similar ways. As we know from studies of medieval philosophy, they imagined revelation, legal authority, and those are the big sort of topics. And when you can read these things in a very fine-grained way, when you read the Baghdadis, say, as a unit, or Jews in medieval Spain as a unit, you can really see correspondence, of course, with Jews from elsewhere, but primarily with non-Jews from their very neighborhoods, right? We know that in medieval Cordoba, a lot of thinking was going on about legal authority. And one of the arguments that I make is that that's very similar to the way that Jews imagine legal authority to have functioned. So I'm not studying these worlds, these imagined worlds, independent from the world around them, but really as representative of the world construction that was being done in their specific time and specific place. Marty, you're still muted.
I'll get this eventually. Elisheva, your turn, please.
Okay, thank you. So I'm an early modernist, and I'll say a word about some of the things that I had looked at in the past and where they intersect with this question. My first book was about what is defined as heresy in the Jewish community, and I thought that was a really important way to discover what Jews considered to be normative belief and what they considered to be in some way heterodoxical, just beyond the pale, so to speak. My second book, which led straight out of that one, again looks at a borderline or intersection point between Jews and the larger culture by looking at the question of conversion, particularly Jews converting to the non-Jewish larger culture, in my case, Christian. And there are some really interesting contrast points with the medieval period. When you look at a place like Spain, polemics that were or disputations that were supposed to lead to conversion of Jews were public events, very often royally sponsored, They played an absolutely pivotal role in the Jewish-Christian encounter. Whereas in the early modern period, it's almost always individuals. It becomes a much more subtle tension in that relationship. So that was my second attempt at trying to get to the intersection between Jews and the larger community. Now I'm focusing on Jewish communal life. What you have in the early modern period are an immense number of records, a record-keeping culture that didn't exist to that extent in the Middle Ages. And the question is, why not? That's something I can't answer yet. And maybe it's a wrong assumption. Eve and Mark can correct me. But even looking at the interactions between Jews and non-Jews, whether it's commercial interactions, daily interactions of neighbors, negotiating for political rights, ultimately, the religious ideas that undergird each of these sides, if you will, determine what the essential differences are. And these are changeable over time. They change over time and must be taken into account. Even if you're doing social history of Jews, you cannot forget about the ideological underpinnings of Judaism. So that's important going in, and something that I think modern historians can take from the study of medieval Jewish life.
Thank you very much, Elisheva. Eve?
Thank you so much. And I want to just backtrack because I jumped into my first answer without thanking you for having me or congratulating you on having Mark. So it's great to be here. And now I'll answer. So I always sort of introduce myself as a historian of medieval Jews and Judaism, which is a very unwieldy way of saying that I'm interested both in the everyday, ordinary experiences and assumptions of people in medieval Egypt and Syria who sort of identified themselves and were identified by others as Jews. And in that work, I'm very, very fortunate to work with what is probably, well, not probably, what I believe is the most amazing, rich, intimate, close-up look at any medieval society, really, that we have from anywhere in the world, which is the documents of the Cairo Geniza, which is this huge collection of, we think, maybe some 40,000 fragments of everyday writing that survived amongst a much bigger collection of other kinds of fragments in the synagogue in Cairo. And it just gives us this absolutely, dazzling close-up look, which of course also has its limits at what these Jewish people's lives were like in the 11th and 12th centuries. In this region. So when I am doing that kind of work, social history, I'm mostly interested in sort of things that any social historian would be interested in. I mean, the thing that grabs my attention about history always is what was different and what was the same. And my first book was on young women coming of age in this milieu. And there were sort of, just incredibly wild, interesting things that I found about how Jews understood, young women's position in society, their relationship to their relatives. I'll just name what is, always the most surprising one for anyone is that the overwhelming evidence we have from the Geniza shows that women were much more attached to their birth relatives throughout their lives than they ever became to their husbands. So they had very, very strong ongoing bonds with their parents, siblings, and then eventually their children. And most of the time, it seems like the marriage relationship was understood as a much more transactional and often temporary one in a lot of ways. Now, that's not a particularly Jewish thing, I don't think, meaning it's true of Jews in this society, but it was probably true of Muslims and Christians too. Now I'm working on death. And again, I'm just very interested in how these people thought about and experienced death and mourning and their own impending deaths as they approach death in ways that are probably not specific to Jews. But that's not to say that their being Jewish didn't matter, right? So almost all the sources we have, including the Geniza sources, are heavily inflected with these people's Jewish identity, with the Jewish traditions that the leaders and elites of the community were drawing on. And in some cases, it really did make a difference. So I'm not advocating for sort of just thinking of Jews like everyone else. They weren't. I'm interested in seeing where the differences actually lay. So that's the kind of Jews part of it. I'm also very interested in Judaism. As Elisheva said, we can't just assume that we know what Judaism was in any given time and place. And in fact, I think, one of the major things that I want to highlight that both of you already said is that medieval Judaism was incredibly dynamic and incredibly interesting as a system of thought and practice. And so I'll close by saying that the thing I'm working on right now in between young women and death is something that sounds really dry and boring, which is medieval Jewish formulary. But what I'm actually trying to understand is how medieval Judaism, as a kind of incredibly, in some ways, stable and widespread textualized system, came to be in the first place. So part of the reason that early modernists used to look back at the Middle Ages and think that it was all kind of, the same, is that by the 10th century, we do have this really diffuse system of writing in a Jewish way among elites that develops. That's always either rabbinic or anti-rabbinic, meaning there's no other options. And I think one of the big things that's happening now in the field is people are looking backwards and thinking about, well, what happened between, the rabbis of late antiquity, of the Talmud, and the 10th century that made Judaism look like this. Actually, that was a period of incredibly dynamic and interesting change too. The problem is we don't really have any sources that explain why it happened. So I'm doing this very kind of dry, boring work looking at early medieval Jewish legal formulary, meaning the boilerplate way in which documents are written, to try to get at, how that developed and what came before.
Thank you very much. Sounds fascinating. I look forward to reading your work on that. As professors in the university, research is a very large part of our job, but also teaching. And I want to move the discussion now to the question of how we see our role as teachers. For me, the biggest shift in my career was when I began teaching Jewish studies courses. The students were either 100% Jews in the class or close to 100% Jews in the classroom. And by the time I retired, that was no longer the case at all. And there are very often Jewish studies courses in many universities where the majority of the students are not Jewish, as best as we can tell. We don't, of course, poll our students to find out, but it seems like we are now often teaching Jewish studies courses to a clientele who are not specifically Jewish. So with that challenge in mind, I'd like to ask the panelists, how do we make our field of study relevant to undergraduate students in the university? If we have a graduate student comes to us because she or he wants to be dealing with the Cairo Geniza, we know what to do with those students. But how do we package something that is of interest to the undergraduate students that we encounter in our universities these days? And if we're attracting non-Jewish students to our courses, what is it that we're trying to tell them about the Jewish experience in our courses? And what is it that we want when we are teaching Jewish students, or people who are sometimes referred to as heritage learners, the ones who come, they're taking something else in the university and just decide, well, since this is my heritage, I will take a course that's related to Judaism. Elisheva, could you kick off the discussion on this?
Well, thank you very much. The first thing I would say is you're absolutely right. One cannot assume teaching in any university today, except maybe in a Jewish university, that students, whether or not they are Jewish, have any prior Jewish knowledge. When teaching undergraduates, yes, some students have had traditional Jewish educations and can read texts, but those are often actually educations that can distort just as well as they can inform. So the first thing a professor has to know is that certainly in a lower level undergraduate course, you're introducing concepts, you're introducing arguments, you're introducing bodies of knowledge that most undergraduate students have not had a chance to encounter. And the most important thing that any historian can teach their students is that while we cannot change the past, we are constantly changing the way we look at the past. So the scholarship is extremely dynamic. Eve used that word, and that's the one that I underlined here. We have to convey that excitement, that dynamism to our students. At Columbia, I teach a course, which I'm totally unqualified to teach, called Medieval Jewish Cultures. And spanning the divide as a non-specialist myself between Ashkenaz and Sepharad, East and West, the delicate balance between introducing students to the major themes, minority, majority dynamics, mobility, identity, gender, but it's also important for me to bring in what I would call material culture, the arts. I try to show them that there's an absolute multiplicity of approaches. When I began to teach a course like that 30 years ago, there just wasn't a lot of material. Today, there's an embarrassment of riches. So I think the most important thing is to take a classroom full of students of very varied backgrounds and fire them all up to let them know that what they're seeing here is a very dynamic society, constantly innovating, constantly trying to come to grips with a society that both welcomed them at certain times, but at other times, as Salo Baron once put the definition of anti-Semitism, expressed strongly their dislike of the unlike. So let's leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Elisheva. Eve?
Yeah. So I have the same experience, although my experience doesn't extend back as far. So actually, in the time that I've been teaching, it's always been the case that I have students of many varied backgrounds, some of whom come in knowing Jewish texts, some of whom don't, whether they understand themselves to be Jewish or not. So the question as I received it was, how do you make the subject relevant? And I think I don't believe in relevance. So what I mean is I think students respond to things that are interesting. And I actually think that the most interesting things are often the things that are totally outside their experience. And so I would say, if I think something is really interesting, I try to convey that to my students in whatever way I can. The challenge is, both getting the whole historical picture across and actually allowing the students to step into this world themselves in the same way that we as researchers do by looking at texts. And this has been, I have to admit, a real learning curve for me. So I'm just going to say, when I first started, I think I was a really lousy teacher. I thought that I was supposed to kind of prepare a lecture that gave the students, every big idea that I could pack in and hand it over to them. And over the years, I've realized that, first of all, they're not remembering more than maybe 5% of what I'm saying. And second of all, I'm putting them to sleep. So I've radically changed my teaching now. And what I really do is try to do very, very short, big picture lectures on some of the kind of big themes in scholarship, big time period changes and geographies that they should know, and then really just hand them texts and let them run with it. And the more students sort of break their own heads against medieval Jewish texts, with guidance, I think the more invested and interested they are. And some of my most rewarding teaching experiences have been really sharing Geniza documents about Jews with students who are not necessarily certainly not Jewish and not even there to learn about Judaism. They're there to learn about medieval Egypt. But the human beings in these documents come through in such striking ways, both in ways that are familiar and in ways that are, shockingly strange. That I had a student last year tell me, I always ask students on the last day of class, what are you going to remember about this class in 20 years? And I had a student tell me, well, I think I'm going to remember that human beings were always human beings. And I said, well, it made me happy today.
Thank you. That's very nice. Just what you said about enthusiasm. I remember a number of years ago, I read a study of student evaluations of professors, and the person who conducted this study found that usually in student evaluations, the last question is overall, how would you rate the professor in this course? And there are many other questions before you get to that question. And the study compared the answers to overall, how would you rate the instructor to the previous questions. And they found that the closest connection is between that overall assessment and the enthusiasm that the professor brings to his or her work. And, it's clear to me that we have panelists today who are very enthusiastic about what they do. And I agree with you that if we can convey some of this enthusiasm to our students, that's a wonderful thing. Mark?
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what's been said. I think that I'm not quite sure that the problem is one of relevance, but one of sort of telling good stories. I think our primary task as historians is to tell a good story. And the Jewish story is as good as any. It goes back very far. It's got a lot of interesting characters, a lot of twists and turns. And I think that if teachers of Jewish history can convey the word that we use a lot is dynamism, the diversity, the real complications of Jewish history, it's a very compelling part of the human story. And in that sense, it can be relevant to any student, regardless of their background. Right? We talk about, if you look at Eve's work about marriage and the lives of young women, that is not, it's a Jewish story because the sources are Jewish, but it speaks to a larger part of the human experience that is relevant, I think, in many ways, to the way we think of it. And the example can be given for a lot of different Jewish texts. So I think that part of the first responsibility, as I see it, of any teacher is to tell good stories and to teach the history in a way that speaks to larger humanistic problems. I think one of the, in my more limited experience teaching, one of the important lessons I try to convey is that Jews were part of the society, and if we want to understand any society in which Jews lived, one needs to understand not just the majority culture. If you want to understand what medieval Europe was like, you have to understand it from all its different vantage points. And in that sense, the Jews bring something to the table that you wouldn't necessarily get if you only studied a majority culture. And I think that my hope, is that students from all backgrounds can relate to that. They can understand that, the minorities are an important part of any society, that the experience of the minority tells you something beyond whatever numbers they were, whatever percentage Jews were in this society. Who knows? But let's say, 2%, 5%, 10%, whatever the number might be in any different time and place, that can tell you much more than just they're much more significant than the numbers suggest. And that significance, I think, lies in looking back in a mirror on the bigger society and telling you that, what was representative of that society, that even if you weren't, going to church, you may have experienced as part of that world. So I think Jews, when they're taught as part of when they're taught as part of a humanistic story, they can really convey a lot for the larger humanist story of human history.
Thank you. And the last question that I have for the panelists before we open up to questions from the audience here is that predicting the future is never easy, but where do you see the field going? What new work are graduate students doing now that you think will shape the field in coming years? What's on the research agenda in general? How do you hope to contribute to Jewish studies and to the humanities more generally? And those simple questions, I'll start with you, Eve, please.
Sure. So, I mean, the first thing I'll say is that I fully expect that the next generation of scholars will find that our generation was wrong about things, maybe about everything, and we'll find new vistas that I can't think of right now. But what I see going on right now is that a lot of the work that we've been discussing for the last 51 minutes is continuing and just expanding. People are finding new sources, in particular, the use of archives and documents for Jewish history has exploded. This has also led to new ways of reading the sources that we already had. But I guess what I'll talk about is less kind of the new questions that are going to dominate and more the methods. So there's a lot more collaborative work going on in my field than there was a generation ago. In fact, when Esti Goitain, the founding father of social history using the Geniza, at one point was asked about the future of his field, what he envisioned was that each subtopic that the Geniza illuminates, communal history, women's history, economic history, would be parceled out to a specialist in that field who really, knew that material in depth and would do it on its own. So the field doesn't work like that actually at all anymore. It's much more collaborative, not just within Geniza studies, but also between people who study the Geniza and people who study Arabic script documents, produced by Muslims and Christians that survived in other places, between intellectual historians and social historians. There's just way more sort of cross-pollination going on, I think, and I expect that to expand. Computers are a force both for good and bad, and on the good ledger, there's a lot of things going on in digital humanities work that I think are going to make texts much more accessible and much more usable in lots of ways than they used to be. And since Elisheva is on the panel, I actually have to tell this funny story, which is that when I was a postdoc at Columbia, I met at one point, I was having a conversation with Elisheva, and she mentioned work that she had heard about training computers to read documents in Arabic and Hebrew script. And I said, that's not possible. Human beings can barely read medieval documents in Arabic script. They're illegible and the letters look completely different. And then I actually had to write her an email about 5 years later. Oh, I actually found out that this is happening. I was just wrong. And now the Geniza Lab, which I'm a part of at Princeton, is heavily involved with this project with a scholar in Europe, Daniel Stoffel Ben Ezra, that actually they've almost cracked it. They've gotten AI to read Geniza documents, 90% plus accuracy. And what that means is that you can simply have access to what's in this cache much more quickly than you had before, and understand things that, would have taken a scholar a decade to find a corpus. Now you can do it automatedly. All of that is very wonderful and really changing things a lot. But what I want to close by saying is that doesn't mean that the old skills and the old ways of doing things don't matter. And my hope is that the really kind of deep training in how to read texts that used to be the bulk of what training in medieval Jewish history was needs to continue and will not die away. And we can't, let go of it. Those skills are just as important, and in some ways still the centrally important thing, even as we move into this bold new future. And I guess the final thing I'll say is that I just, the humanities, as we all know, are in something of crisis across fields and across countries right now. And it's very much my hope that we will get more students into the classroom in the first place. I think once we get them there, they are interested, but getting them there in the first place is the challenge. And, big scale structural things that are out of all of our control, that are making the study of the humanities less tenable than it used to be, hopefully will change in the next generation. That's my hope.
Thank you for your very thoughtful answer. I always felt that the most important thing that I was doing as a professor was teaching people how to read a text, and reading texts together, and working on the reading of the text, and just picking up on something that Elisheva said before that I totally agree with, that often when people come into our courses with previous knowledge of Jewish texts, we have to kind of work against that previous knowledge in order to turn it into an academic kind of knowledge. But when they come in with the ability to read a Hebrew text, I always was delighted. It was easier to be doing many of the things that I wanted to be doing as a professor when people came in with that skill. There's cost and a benefit to the previous background that people have. Elisheva, could I pass it over to you?
Sure. So I agree with everything that Eve said, and I'll just make a few more comments, which is that it's really important for us to be attracting undergraduate students because undergraduate enrollments drive the hiring priorities. And as the humanities gets into its crisis, or, this is a across the spectrum kind of thing, it's not just medieval Jewish history that has difficulty attracting students, it's medieval history or medieval philosophy. It's something that happens across the board, and that's something we need to actively work against. We need to market courses in a way that attracts students. Medieval Jews in medieval Spain might not attract that many, but race and gender in Jewish medieval Spain might, or some other way. So even we can polemicize against relevance, but things like mysticism and magic tend to draw undergraduate curious students to a greater extent, I think, than courses that have bland titles. So even in certain small ways like that, we need to think about how to draw students into the room and then how to retain them once they're in. And I think it's important for those of us who have any kind of administrative ear or positions to drive home the message that Jews were the most prominent minorities in Europe for most of Jewish history, and how their difference was constructed, how their cultures remained resilient in the face of many obstacles, is still a model for modern society as well. So that's one thing. And finally, I just want to mention, in case it doesn't come up in talking about collaboration and scholars collaborating across fields, there needs to be more collaboration, I think, between Israeli scholars, European scholars, and American scholars. I think those types of collaborations that have a training of different types of scholars with different disciplinary approaches intersecting fruitfully with one another helps continue to shape a more dynamic field. So although I am very concerned for the future in terms of there not being that many American universities that value what we are teaching, I also think that it's an opportunity for us to try to message and market what we have to as broad an audience as possible.
Thank you very much. Mark, we'll give you the last word here before we open up to the audience.
Yeah, I obviously agree with a lot of what's been said already. I think I would just, looking at the field or trying to get a sort of bird's eye view of the field as a whole, I really get the sense that in terms of the graduate student and the writing and the production of scholarly works, it's almost as robust, if not more, than it ever has been. The diversity of questions that are being asked, the caliber of research that's being done is incredibly high. In North America, in Europe, and in Israel, my feeling, although I don't have as much experience as everyone else here, but my feeling is that it really is a quite robust field in terms of the kind of work that's being done and the questions that are being asked. And just the sheer quantity of publications is often difficult to keep up with. I think that in my smaller subfield of sort of more intellectually inclined historians, I think that people are very curious and thinking about sort of models of contact. I think that's one of the major issues that maybe I can't speak so far in advance, but maybe even just now that we realize that Jews were so integrated into the world around them, one question we have to ask is sort of why did they retain their commitments to Judaism, and what did Judaism mean for them? And if they were so integrated, why did they choose to be Jewish? Why did they remain part of their societies? And so, if we really imagine that, certainly in points in the Islamic world and other places as well, that Jews were really, really well integrated, I think one of the questions that scholars are now have to answer is sort of, okay, so if you're so integrated, why did you stay part of your community? There could be all sorts of answers, and maybe some of that question can't be answered at all. But I think it's a worthwhile question to be asked. And so the combination of those sort of textual skills that have been spoken about already, and some of these new ways of thinking are, I think, are some of the next questions that need to be on the table. And yeah, just to finish up, I guess to echo what's already been said, the society is only really understood in its full richness by understanding these worlds in their broadest possible way. And I think that the field can really benefit from a full, rather than siloing different topics, really integrating social, intellectual, cultural, political histories in larger ways, and asking sort of new integrated questions. I think, as you've said, it's really the way to go.
Okay, thank you very much. And now we will turn to the questions that have been submitted by the audience. Can I hand the floor back to you, David?
I will. I'm going to read some questions, and we'll try to do it with some brevity so we can get through as many as possible. I also just wanted to quickly say thank you, panelists. This was actually brilliant and thrilling and super fascinating discussion. And thank you, Marty, for leading us through it. First question is from Baruch Friedman Cole. Yeah, he writes, in the 1930s, Abraham Joshua Heschel contended that Jewish philosophers were actually responding to real life questions rather than abstract concerns. He wants to know how your research indicates or reflects theological issues, even on a grassroots level. And I suppose what I'll say is maybe we'll have like one person answer. If another one person really wants to answer as well, then they can jump in, but we don't want to have all three people answer every question, so we can just get through a bunch. Anyone want to take a stab at that first one?
Well, I was going to volunteer Mark, but Mark is shaking his head no. So I'll just say very quickly, grassroots is the only thing I do. I don't do theology. I am in the very early stages of this project on death. And I actually presented at a conference this summer. And the first person raised his hand, and he studies Kabbalah, and he said, this theology is so simple-minded. And I said, yes, that's why I love it. So what I'm doing is sort of ordinary people's ideas about death. We get a lot from documents in mourning letters. And I'll just say that the very interesting thing that I found so far, because I'm in the super early stages of this research, is that mourning letters from the Geniza constantly invoke this widespread theological idea of submission, resignation, endurance to God's will in the face of death, while at the exact same time absolutely expressing, incredibly long descriptions of heartrending, unending grief. And that's a very interesting juxtaposition that I see, and that you can actually trace even from Geniza material all the way to Maimonides himself, who both says in the Mishneh Torah that only a fool, carries on mourning for very long, and that whenever he sees his brother's handwriting, he cries even a decade later or something like that.
Yeah, just maybe to be the second one. I'm sorry, I apologize, David, for having two people answer the question. I wish I could answer this question well when it comes to some of the intricacies of medieval Jewish theology. I assume then, as now, it had a relatively limited audience, probably much more limited then than now, given the explosion of Jewish learning. But that's not to say that but that being said, I think it's also important to realize that these ideas were formulated very much in a lived context. Right? When Maimonides, for example, formulates his principles of faith, one has to think, well, why did he highlight point A and not point B? And oftentimes the reason is because these issues were, these questions were at issue in the society in which he lived. So, the eternality of the law was obviously a hot button issue in the medieval Islamic world. And so maybe it's hard to understand what was going on the grassroots level, but it's pretty striking how they're trying to produce relevant theologies and things that would speak to their larger, to the society and the people who haven't left us their literary remains.
One of our guests, Bruce Miller, wants to know where he can go for a good list of recommended books on medieval Judaism. Do you guys have any suggestions you can maybe drop them in the the chat to everyone if you know of any book lists out there. I don't think we need to produce one right now because that might take a little bit of time, but recommendations would be appreciated by Bruce and many others, I'm sure. Next question is from Donnie Friedman on behalf of Jerry Friedman. She wants to know from Professor Karlbach in particular, in medieval Jewish communities, was heresy understood in terms of behavior or belief?
Sorry about that. That's an excellent question. And the answer is both to some extent, depending on the community and on the time. And just to go back to the first question, think about somebody like Spinoza, who's not medieval, but who nevertheless probably could have gone on articulating his very heretical beliefs. But it's only when he insisted on publicizing and publishing them that he was ostracized by the community, banned, excommunicated. In many Jewish societies, if you kept your non-observance and or heretical ideas private, there was no inquisition. It was only the public exposure of them to possibly impressionable minds that tended to raise the community's hackles. But I would let some of the other panelists also respond if they have another view.
No, I agree fully. That's what we see in my part of the world too. You can think and even do a lot of things, but it's when it sort of you take those things public. And so, for example, in the case of the use of non-Jewish courts, which is something that comes up in the Geniza all the time, it's perfectly fine. It's perfectly accepted. Everybody does it. It's when you go to an Islamic court to challenge the Jewish court that it becomes a problem.
Yeah, David, can I just jump on in the book list suggestion for one?
Just
something that came to mind now. I think there are a number of journals in the field that maintain robust review sections. So, and if the Association for Jewish Studies Review, for example, in addition to a number of scholarly articles, does a very has a very active book review section, and it's sometimes helpful just to look at the titles there. So what's getting attention in the field, what is new and exciting. These things are delayed, maybe a year or two, but that's more than enough to keep up with the field. So sometimes it might be helpful just to look at some the AJS Review or maybe similar journals in the book reviews, just to get a sense of the new and exciting work that are in various fields. And oftentimes, the AJS Review, for example, does divide their review sections into period, which is helpful for somebody looking, in rabbinics or modern or whatever it might be. Might be one way to keep up with what's going on.
Thank you. The next question comes from Michael Nutkowitz. Pardon me if I've butchered your last name. He was interested in a question about translation, if there's enough translation given general student inability to read in source languages other than English. But he has an extra spin on it, which is about AI translation. Whether AI translation makes it even less likely that students will be drawn to learn languages at all.
Well, I should just clarify, I was talking about AI transcription. So you still need to be able to, the translation as a whole, especially with everyday documents where we often are just guessing what they meant, when they said, a fish in your eye or other, I just made that up, but idioms that we don't understand. There's a ton of translations out there. And I want to especially plug the Posen Library volumes, which Elisheva just co-edited, I believe, right? The early modern one. And I know Arnold Franklin is about to come out with a just unbelievable medieval one. But even without those, there are translations out there of every kind of text imaginable, really a wealth of translation. I think it's very possible to do a lot of reading. I mean, it's even better to read it in the original, but even without it, it really is possible.
David, may I say something here. I totally agree. It's wonderful how many translations are out there, and I've published translations, and I'm glad to contribute towards the spreading of classical Jewish texts in translation. I'll just say that there's a development in academia that I saw in some of my last years before retirement that I didn't see in Jewish studies, but that I did see in other areas of people writing doctoral dissertations that dealt with texts that they were reading in translation. And the first time that I saw it, I was just totally flabbergasted. How could somebody dedicate a doctoral dissertation to a corpus of writing that they aren't able to read in the original? And I was even, I saw this in the humanities. I also was once asked to be the outside reader for a doctoral dissertation written in political science, and the student was writing about texts that were Arabic texts that were blending together the Islamic thought and political thought, and the student wasn't reading them in the original. I don't know, maybe I'm just an old-fashioned old man. I found this very troubling, and I'm glad to say that I haven't seen this phenomenon in the study of classical Judaica.
I'd like to twist us a little bit. I was really taken by their panelists' comments about collaborative work, collaborative possibilities for the future. As a non-special in this field, I think about collaboration in my own field all the time and all the opportunities that are available. I was wondering if you might blue sky some projects, ambitious projects, and give us audience members some sense of what possibilities might be done if this was done really effectively, even with larger groups, like things that we really don't know yet that could be gained. Like if I would just say, I have a grant ready to go for this kind of collaborative work, and there's a ton of money, everyone could get fully supported to do it. Like what would be your top picks? And I would love to hear from each of you. And Marty, if you've got one too, I would love to hear from you as well. Oh, and to the people, the attendees, we still have a little bit more time, and we only have one more question in the Q&A queue. So if you have a question, you can feel free to drop it in the Q&A as well. Sorry to put you all on the spot for grant applications that you weren't planning on writing, but I'm sure you come up with something.
Well, I do want to, I'll jump in by saying that in some parts of the world, there are not as many opportunities to apply for these large grants. There's something called the European Research Council, the America-Israel Foundation. There are several, I'm not sure what their names are, but there are several large foundations that support collaborative work across multiple researchers at multiple levels of seniority, from doctoral students to senior scholars. There are very few of them in the United States that are not in the hard sciences. Very few opportunities. The NEH, for example, mostly funds individual scholars. So when you ask about those collaborations, I think they have to happen more organically and on a smaller scale for some groups of researchers than for others. That said, I want to highlight one that just completed a 5-year multi-person collaboration. Elisheva Baumgarten's group, which studied, again, the daily lives of medieval Europeans with a gender highlighted balance, but it wasn't just restricted to that. I think is a wonderful, wonderful example of collaborative work funded by the ERC, encompassing researchers really from all over the world. It was a wonderful group and a model of what could be done. And if anybody who is the head of an American foundation and wants to fund something good in Jewish studies, this is the route to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, so I guess I I don't have a stack of grant application ideas waiting to go. So instead, I'll talk about actually some of the projects that are ongoing that I'm really excited about. I'm incredibly lucky to be involved with the Princeton Geniza project, which is run by Professor Marina Rusto, and which is just a model of collaboration and collaborative work. There's a lot of people working on this project, and its sort of main goals are, first of all, to get descriptions and eventually transcriptions and translations of as many Geniza documents as possible up publicly accessible on the internet. But beyond that, there's all kinds of other both computer science type things and research things going on in the lab. And what makes it such a great community to be a part of is that it's just an incredibly friendly, generous community of people who are happy to share knowledge with each other. There's a Geniza Labs Slack, which is this kind of online, chatting platform, and people will just post random interesting things that they found. And within 5 minutes, somebody has chimed in to explain it or to transcribe it or translate it. That's really great. Another collaborative thing that I see happening in my own subfield and that I think is really exciting and important is collaboration between people who work on Jewish material or material produced by Jews in the sort of early and middle Islamic medieval Near East, and people who work on Christians and Muslims who are often writing in the same genres about similar things, just each within their own sort of linguistic and religious tradition, and in real life mingling with one another. Those fields are coming together much more closely. So this is less a question of a single grant on a single topic than just the fact that these fields are becoming much more interactive, I think, than they were, a generation ago. And that's I think where the future is headed in my field. And it's really a welcome change that is opening up all kinds of new avenues and new ideas that, weren't around even when I started grad school.
Yeah, in the spring, I was part of a small reading group that read legal sources in Arabic and Judeo-Arabic together, brings people who work on Islamic studies and Jewish studies together, and it was really amazing to see that people coming from different sort of religious area subspecialties, saying, "Wait a second, these texts are incredibly similar. They're working out similar ideas. They're using the same terms," and so I think that if blue skying it, as David said, that would be something that would be fantastic to support on an ongoing basis. Just to maybe tie together a couple of things we've talked about already, I think when people used to study comparative law or legal traditions, they sometimes took these big corpora as whole units and said, what does Jewish law say about X? And they could study a source from the 6th century and the 16th century and the 20th century and sort of make a conversation. And then compare that to, say, Islamic law, where you have not quite as long, but almost as long history of legal discussions, and come up with sort of these sort of big normative points of view. And I think what this seminar in the spring that I participated in told me, something similar to what Eve just spoke about, is that when you focus more on the societies, the times and places, let's say you did legal sources from Baghdad in the 10th century, you would get a totally different picture of what these traditions looked like and how they worked on the ground. And you get a much better sense of how each of their Jewish, Christian, Muslim neighbors were producing legal traditions in very similar keys. And that would give a whole different picture rather than looking at a big, long tradition. Focusing on a narrower body of literature would be a new way, surprisingly that it still is, but a new way perhaps to put these things in conversation.
Marty, did you want to have a stab at this one?
I was just going to say that if I were younger and I were looking for a large collaborative project to do right now, I've recently befriended a professor in Spain named Montse Lera Correa, who's a Catholic who has a great expertise in the Bible commentaries that were produced in medieval times, and she and I talk all the time about the interplay between what Jews were writing about the Bible and non-Jews were writing about the Bible at the same time. And she came up with a book that really talks about this issue, but there's a lot more work to do in this area, and these are exciting ways in which people who come from very different backgrounds and very different worlds can work together on something that could be, I think, of great value in scholarship.
Our last question comes from Zipporah Clapper, who asks about the kind of theme we had been talking about with respect to relevance with Jewish and non-Jewish students. She asked, what is and what ought to be the relationship of academic Jewish studies as a field to contemporary Jewish communities? Good question, something we haven't touched on yet. So is or should be, or perhaps I might add, yeah, you can describe. I mean, I'm not sure if anyone's in the mood for prescription, but maybe description. Do you see some issues, some dynamics that are here about sort of how the Jewish Academy concerned with this era and this period intersects with contemporary concerns and Jewish communities and politics?
I think my first answer, just initially, is that it's almost inevitable that there's going to be contact. Right? A lot of the students that are going to be attracted to do more serious work in pre-modern Jewish history are going to be Jewish. They're going to come with the skills. They're going to have sort of commitments or engagement with the community. And that in of itself is a service that the Academy can sort of provide the community in terms of giving an outlet for students who are interested in this kind of material, or educating more public-facing history. At the same time, I think the Academy and the community benefits a lot from having sort of independence in the university setting. The kind of questions that can be asked in the Academy are sometimes different than those that are going to be asked in communal institutions, without the baggage, without the need to sort of, whatever needs are brought in the community can sometimes be different kind of needs than you have in a university setting. And so I think that this, just on one foot, I think the interactions are inevitable and can be very fruitful. But at the same time, having independence and having different sort of bases of learning and centers is also very, very important.
So let me just add to that. The first thing I kind of disagree with at this point in both our profession, but also in terms of the students we attract, having a Jewish identity of any kind is not supposed to be a factor in appointments, in student enrollment, or anything like that. We have brilliant, dazzling scholarship in all fields and all periods that comes out of people who are not Jewish in any way, but have committed their lifetime scholarship to studying Jewish society or Jewish texts. So I just want to say that. That said, I think universities have an obligation to engage the larger community, and we do that by public lectures and by opening certain events to community members who are not academics. And that's one way of bridging that gap. I don't think any university should tolerate, communal interference into any kind of scholarly or academic matters. On the other hand, there is, remember that community members are those who often underwrite much of our programming and even our chairs. And we want to be sure that we give back in a way that's enriching and stimulating to the larger community.
I guess I should just say that I fully agree, with all of the above. I think I would like to see more people who don't identify as Jewish involved in Judaic studies. Actually, I guess that's the last thing I'll say. When I look at my kind of neighbor field of Islamic studies, there is much more of a balance between people who identify as Muslims and people who don't engaging in Islamic studies than there is in Jewish studies. And I would like to see that change. And I guess, getting more undergrads in our courses and hooked on this subject is the way to try to make that happen.
Well, thank you, panelists. This was an absolutely wonderful discussion. I appreciate you all taking time on a Sunday to do so. Thank you also, Marty. I just wanted to note before we close that you can join our Center for Jewish Studies email list or find us on social media if you'd like to know more about our wonderful and rich public programs, which is part of the scholars and a scholarly unit's job to share with the broader world. Our next program will be a live event. I'm going to put it in the chat here. That's in person on York University campus. It's a kind of concert and talk back with the award-winning Jewish intercultural ensemble Jaffa Road. It's next Sunday at York University. This is the launch actually for a series of music-related events that we're hosting called Sound and Sense Jewish Music at York, which will have a bunch of wonderful events in a range of media. Some of them will be remote or hybrid, all about making and enjoying global Jewish music. And on November 10th, we'll be hosting a webinar as part of Holocaust Education Week in Canada. You can join us for a pair of short lectures and then a dialogue between two scholars under the title Greek Jewry, the Holocaust and Public Reckoning Today, about memory of the Holocaust and the public memory of the Holocaust in Greece, with professors Sakis Gekas, who's a historian of modern Greece right here at York, and Professor Devin Nair, who will be joining us from the University of Washington. So I'm going to put that in the link as well, in the chat as well before we close. And again, thank everyone very graciously for giving us your time and your insight. It was a pleasure learning from you all. Be well.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thank you all, panelists.